discovered it on a Tuesday afternoon when I was looking for cleaning supplies in the storage area behind the main floor, pushing my cart through the familiar aisles of overstock and discontinued items, when I noticed a door I'd never seen before, painted the same industrial beige as the walls, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But there it was, slightly ajar, with a handwritten sign that read, "Clearance, 90% off, employees only." He had worked at Morrison's department store for 3 years, knew every corner of the building, every storage closet and utility room, and this door had never existed before. I was certain of it, but when I asked Rita, my supervisor who'd been there for 15 years, she just looked at me with confusion and said, "Of course, it's always been there. How could you not know about the clearance section?" The door opened onto a staircase leading down, which made no sense, because we were on the ground floor. There was nothing below us except the foundation, but the stairs were there, concrete and solid, lit by fluorescent lights that flickered in a rhythm that made my eyes hurt. I descended slowly, one hand on the railing, and emerged into a space that shouldn't exist, a vast section of the store that stretched far beyond the building's actual footprint, filled with aisles and aisles of merchandise, all of it marked with bright red tags proclaiming massive discounts. The air down there was different, colder and stale, with an underlying smell like formaldehyde mixed with artificial flowers, and the lighting had a greenish tint that made everything look slightly wrong, slightly diseased. I walked down the first aisle, past racks of clothing in styles I didn't recognize, designer labels I'd never heard of, and that's when I noticed the tags, each item marked not just with a price but with a name, handwritten in small, neat letters. Sarah Chen, Michael Rodriguez, Jennifer Park, names that meant nothing to me until I remembered the missing persons bulletin board in the break room, the faces of people who'd vanished from town over the past 2 years. And these were their names, every single one. My hand shook as I examined a beautiful winter coat, marked down from $800 to $80, tagged with the name David Morrison, and I remembered him. Remembered seeing his face on the news 6 months ago. A college student who'd disappeared after his shift at the grocery store, never seen again, and here was his coat, here on a hanger, in this impossible place, still smelling faintly of his cologne. I should have left then, should have run back up those stairs and quit my job and tried to forget, but the clearance section had a pull to it, a magnetic quality that made me want to see more, to understand what I was looking at, and I continued deeper into the aisles, past electronics and furniture and jewelry, all of it tagged with names of the missing, all of it discounted to almost nothing. The section seemed to go on forever, curving in ways that defied geometry, and I lost track of time wandering through it until I turned a corner and found myself facing a checkout counter, old-fashioned and ornate, and standing behind it was Tom Brennan, my coworker who'd called in sick 3 weeks ago and never returned. He smiled when he saw me. That same friendly smile I remembered, but his eyes were wrong, filmed over with something milky and distant, and when he spoke his voice had a hollow quality, like sound echoing up from a well. "Welcome to clearance," he said, his smile never wavering. "Are you finding everything you need? We have excellent prices today. Everything must go. And I notice you've been browsing for quite a while. Perhaps you'd like to make a purchase." I backed away, stammering that I was just looking, that I needed to get back to work. But Tom's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, stretching his face in ways that made his skin look like rubber. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to buy anything today, but you'll be back. They always come back. The clearance section has a way of staying with you, getting into your thoughts, and eventually everyone who finds it ends up making a purchase, ends up paying the price, and then they get to work here too. It's really quite a good arrangement. The benefits are permanent." Story 1. The Doll Maker's Apprentice. The letter arrived 3 days after my grandmother died. I hadn't seen her in 15 years, not since the incident at her workshop when I was 12, not since the night I ran screaming from that place and refused to speak about what I'd seen for 6 months afterward. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with actual wax that bore the imprint of a tiny hand, and inside was a single key attached to a note written in her spidery handwriting. "The workshop is yours now," it read. "You were always meant to inherit it. I'm sorry I couldn't prepare you properly, but the dolls have been waiting, and they're getting impatient." My hands trembled as I held that key, and I should have thrown it away, should have burned the whole letter and tried to forget. But you don't understand what it's like to have unfinished business with the dead, especially when that business involves questions that have haunted you for more than half your life. The workshop sat on the edge of town, a converted carriage house behind what used to be my grandmother's property, now overgrown and dark, its windows like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. I drove there on a Tuesday morning, the key heavy in my pocket, my stomach twisting with each mile that brought me closer. The door opened with a sound like an exhale, as if the building itself had been holding its breath, and the smell that washed over me was overwhelming. Porcelain dust and old fabric and something else, something organic and wrong that made my throat close. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered. The workbenches lined with half-finished dolls in various states of completion, their blank faces turned toward the door as if they'd been watching it, waiting for someone to enter. Glass eyes in jars caught the dim light filtering through dirty windows, hundreds of them, blue and brown and green and some colors that didn't exist in nature, all seeming to track my movement across the room. The walls were covered in sketches, anatomical drawings of joints and mechanisms, but interspersed among them were other drawings, figures that looked less like dolls and more like something else, something that wore human skin poorly. On the main workbench sat a leather-bound journal, its cover stained with substances I didn't want to identify, and when I opened it, my grandmother's handwriting filled every page in entries that spanned decades. The first entry was dated 1952. "I have accepted the commission," it read. "Mrs. Hartford wants a replacement for the daughter she lost, something that will sit at the dinner table and smile and never grow old or leave her. I know what she's really asking for. I know what all of them are asking for when they come to me with their grief and their money and their terrible, desperate hope." I flipped through the pages, reading entries that detailed her process, the measurements and materials, the specific types of porcelain that held heat like skin, the joints that moved with unnatural fluidity. And then, about 50 pages in, the handwriting changed, became more frantic, the words pressing so hard into the paper they nearly tore through. "They're not just dolls anymore," she wrote. "I don't know when the change happened, but they're aware now. They watch me when I work, they move when I'm not looking, and last night I heard them whispering to each other in the dark." There were rules written on a page that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn thin. Never work on a doll after midnight. Never use your own blood in the paint mixture. Never create a doll in the image of someone still living. Never let them see you sleeping. And never, under any circumstances, make a 13th doll in a single year. The rules were underlined 3 times in red ink, and beneath them, in shakier handwriting, I broke the last rule. God help me, I broke it, and now they want their payment. I felt ice spread through my veins because I remembered that night 15 years ago, when Id found my grandmother working on something that had my face, and Shed screamed when she saw me, not in surprise but in horror. The journal's final entry was dated the day before her death. "The new apprentice must come willingly," it stated. "She must accept the inheritance and cross the threshold of her own accord. Only then will the contract transfer. Only then will they release me from my obligations." I looked up from those words and realized the dolls on the workbenches had shifted position, all of them now facing me directly, their glass eyes reflecting the weak afternoon light in ways that seemed almost intentional. From somewhere in the back room came a sound like small feet shuffling across wooden floorboards, and then a voice, high and crystalline, spoke my name with perfect pronunciation. I should have run then, should have dropped that cursed journal and fled back to my car, but instead I found myself walking toward the back room, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain, as if invisible threads were pulling at my limbs. The back room was darker than the main workshop, lit only by a single grimy window set high in the wall, and arranged in a semicircle on the floor sat 7 dolls, each one exquisite and terrible in its craftsmanship. They ranged in size from toddler to adult, dressed in clothes from different eras, their porcelain faces painted with expressions that were just slightly wrong, smiles too wide or eyes too knowing. The largest doll, seated in the center, wore a Victorian morning dress of black silk, her auburn hair arranged in an elaborate updo, and when she tilted her head to look at me, the movement was so fluid, so utterly unlike the jerky motion of any mechanism, that my breath caught in my throat. "Welcome, doll-maker," she said, and her lips moved in perfect synchronization with the words, "I am Millicent, and we have been waiting for you such a very long time." Perhaps you're wondering where you're watching this from right now, in what corner of the world, in what hour of darkness. If you're still here, if something keeps you from clicking away, then subscribe. Let that small act bind you to what comes next. Tell me this. What do you think my grandmother used to make the dolls wear? What ingredient transformed porcelain and cloth into something that could speak and think and want? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from me, the storyteller tonight, as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. And while you consider that question, tell me in the comments what time it is, where you are, what place you're watching from. I want to know how far these words travel, how many darkened rooms and quiet houses they reach. Now let me tell you what happened next. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, asking what they wanted from me. And Millicent's smile widened until it split her face in a way that should have cracked the porcelain but didn't. "Your grandmother made a bargain," she explained, 70 years ago when she was young and desperate and willing to trade anything for the skill to create us. The previous doll maker taught her the secrets, the real methods that make us more than wood and paint, and in exchange she promised that when her time came, she would provide a successor, someone of her own blood who could continue the work. The other dolls began to move now, standing with movements that were too smooth, too organic, arranging themselves around me in a loose circle. "We need you," a smaller doll said, her voice like wind chimes. "There are people waiting for us, grieving people who need what only we can provide, and without a doll maker to create more of us, we're incomplete. We're purposeless." I shook my head, backing toward the door, insisting I didn't know how to make dolls. He'd never learned the craft, but Millicent laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The knowledge is in your blood," she said. "It passed from your grandmother to you the moment you were born. All you need to do is accept it, pick up the tools, and begin. The rest will come naturally, we promise." My hand found the door frame and I steadied myself, looking at these impossible things that should not exist, these violations of every natural law, and I asked what would happen if I refused. Millicent's expression didn't change, but something in the room grew colder, darker. "Your grandmother tried to refuse once," she said softly. "That's why she looked so much older than her years. That's why her hands shook and her sleep was filled with nightmares. Refusing us has consequences, little doll-maker. Consequences that accumulate like interest on a debt, and eventually, one way or another, the debt is paid." Story 2. The broadcast. The call came through at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I almost didn't answer, because late-night radio hosts learn quickly that nothing good comes from calls after 2 in the morning, but something about the way the line blinked on my console, urgent and insistent, made me press the button and say in my smoothest voice, "You're on the air with Night Conversations. What's keeping you awake tonight?" The voice that responded was male, middle-aged, and shaking with barely controlled panic. "You need to listen to me very carefully," he said. "My name is David Chen, and I don't have much time. There's a broadcast." It started appearing on old television sets about 3 weeks ago. Analog only, the kind with antennas and dials. And once you see it, once you watch it all the way through, you can't stop yourself from doing what it tells you to do. I leaned forward in my chair, glancing at my producer through the glass who was already Googling the name, and I asked him to slow down, to start from the beginning, but his breathing was ragged, words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "It appears at different times," he continued, "always between midnight and 4 a.m., always on Channel 0, which shouldn't even exist on analog sets, and it shows this figure, this person in a gray suit, standing in an empty room, and they give you instructions. 5 specific things you must do before sunrise. And the terrible thing is that the instructions make perfect sense while you're watching. They seem reasonable, necessary even, but afterward, when you try to remember why you did those things, you can't, you just know you had to. My producer was frantically writing notes, mouthing the word prank at me through the glass, but there was something in David Chen's voice, a quality of genuine terror that made my skin prickle. I asked what kind of instructions the broadcast gave, what specific things it told people to do, and for a long moment there was only the sound of his breathing, harsh and quick, before he spoke again. The first instruction is always the same, he whispered. It tells you to disconnect your phone, to turn off your cell and remove the battery if possible, to cut yourself off from any way of calling for help, and you do it because while you're watching, it makes perfect sense. You understand that communication would interfere with the other instructions, that you need to be isolated to complete the task properly. The second instruction varies, but it always involves going somewhere, a specific location that's different for each person. For me, it was the basement of an abandoned factory on the south side. For my neighbor, it was a storage unit shed never rented. Places that should mean nothing to us, but somehow we know exactly where they are and how to get there. I was taking my own notes now, my skepticism warring with the growing unease in my gut, and I asked if Head followed these instructions, if Head actually gone to the factory. His laugh was bitter, edged with something close to hysteria. Of course I did, he said. I had no choice. The compulsion was overwhelming, like being a puppet with someone else pulling the strings, and when I got there, when I opened that door and went down those stairs, I found them, dozens of people, all standing in neat rows, in the dark, all waiting for something, and they all had the same blank expression, the same empty eyes. And I knew I was supposed to join them. That was the third instruction, to take my place in the formation and wait. The studio suddenly felt too cold, too quiet despite the hum of equipment, and I found myself looking at the small television mounted in the corner, an old cathode ray model we kept for nostalgia, its screen dark and dead. I asked David what happened next, why he wasn't still standing in that basement with the others, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I broke the fourth instruction, he said. I don't know how. Something in me resisted. Maybe I looked away from the screen at the wrong moment. Maybe the broadcast glitched. But when I got to the factory and saw all those people, something in my mind snapped back into place and I ran. I ran and I didn't stop until I got home. And now I'm trying to warn people, trying to tell anyone whole listen. But it's hard because the broadcast is spreading. More people are seeing it every night. And the ones who complete all 5 instructions, they don't come back, they just disappear. My producer was shaking his head, making cutting gestures, wanting me to end the call, but I couldn't. Something about David Chen's story had hooked itself into my brain and wouldn't let go. I asked him about the 5th instruction, what the broadcast told people to do after they'd gathered in these locations, and the silence that followed stretched so long I thought Head hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, effectless, as if Head retreated somewhere deep inside himself. I don't know the 5th instruction, he said. I never completed the sequence, but I've been researching, looking into missing persons reports, and there's a pattern. People vanishing without trace in cities all across the country, always in clusters, always after 2 a.m. And if you check their homes, you'll find old television sets, analog models, still warm, still displaying static on channel 0. The call ended abruptly, just a dead line and the hiss of static, and when I tried to call back, the number showed as disconnected. I should have dismissed it, should have moved on to the next caller, but instead, I spent the remaining 2 hours of my show digging deeper, asking listeners if anyone had experienced anything similar, and the responses that came in made my blood run cold. A woman from Portland described finding her husband standing motionless in their garage at 3 a.m., staring at an old television they'd inherited from his parents, his lips moving silently, as if repeating instructions only he could hear. A college student in Michigan talked about his roommate who'd disappeared 3 weeks ago, leaving behind nothing but a note that read in careful handwriting, "Gone to complete the broadcast. Don't look for me. It's better this way. A trucker called in to say he'd seen them while driving through Indiana, groups of people walking along the highway in the pre-dawn darkness, all heading in the same direction, all moving with that same strange synchronized gait. And when Head slowed down to offer help, they'd turned to look at him with eyes that reflected his headlights like an animal's. And Head accelerated away, hands shaking on the wheel. After the show ended, I sat alone in the studio, staring at that old television in the corner, and I did something stupid. Something I knew was dangerous even as I was doing it. I plugged it in, turned the dial to channel 0, and waited. For 20 minutes, nothing happened, just gray, static, and white noise. And I'd almost convinced myself the whole thing was an elaborate hoax when the screen flickered, went black, and then he appeared. The figure in the gray suit stood in a room with no visible walls or ceiling, just endless white space. And when he spoke, his voice came not from the television speakers, but from somewhere behind me, beside me, inside my own head. "Good evening," he said, and though his lips didn't quite match the words, I understood him perfectly. "You have been selected to receive important instructions. Please pay close attention, as they will only be given once. Failure to comply will result in consequences you cannot imagine. But compliance, compliance will bring you peace, purpose, an end to all uncertainty and fear." I wanted to look away, wanted to turn off the television, but my hands wouldn't move. My body had become a thing separate from my will, and all I could do was watch as he raised one hand and began counting on his fingers. "Instruction 1, he said. "Disconnect all communication devices. You must complete this task alone, without interference or interruption." My hand moved on its own, reaching for my phone, and I watched in horror as my fingers, operating independently of my conscious thought, powered it down and removed the battery. "Instruction 2, the figure continued. "Go to the address that is now forming in your mind. You know where it is. You have always known. It is where you belong." And he was right. Suddenly I could see it clearly. An abandoned radio station on the east side of town, closed for 15 years, its windows boarded and its parking lot overgrown. And I knew exactly how to get there. Could picture every turn, every street sign. "Instruction 3, he said, and his smile widened in a way that should have been impossible for a human face. "Join the others who are already waiting. Take your place in the formation. Add your voice to the chorus." Something in me screamed, some small part of my consciousness that remained my own, and I forced my eyes closed, forced my head to turn away from the screen, fighting against the compulsion with every ounce of will I possessed.